"Sir, stop crying. Pack your bags and get out of my house now." Those were the words whispered directly into my ear at my own son's funeral. My son, David, was barely cold in the earth. I was standing there, the freezing rain of an Ontario autumn running down my face, my heart completely shattered into a million pieces. And there she stood, my daughter-in-law, Victoria, looking me dead in the eye with a gaze as cold as the frost on Lake Ontario, calling me a worthless, bankrupt burden in front of everyone who had come to pay their respects. She thought she had won. She thought she was throwing a helpless, broke old man out onto the street. But there was something Victoria didn't know, something that would turn her absolute certainty into a financial nightmare. Before I tell you how this quiet father fought back and dismantled her world piece by piece, please take a moment to subscribe to the Quiet Father channel. On this channel, we share stories about standing up to disrespect, reclaiming your boundaries, and teaching the ungrateful the ultimate lesson in humility. Once you've subscribed, let me know in the comments below which city or province in Canada you are listening from today. I read every single one of your messages, and it warms my heart to see our community growing. Now, let us go back to where the sky first fell. It was a bitter, chilly Tuesday morning in Oakville, Ontario. The mid-October wind whipped off the gray waters of Lake Ontario, forcing a thick, stubborn, dense fog to crawl across my backyard, swallowing the shoreline whole. I sat at my mahogany desk in the study of 447 Maple Street, cradling a warm mug of black coffee, watching the steam rise and vanish into the cold air. I am Thomas Mercer. At 68 years old, I am a retired chartered professional accountant, a CPA. For 40 years, my late wife, Margaret, and I lived a life of quiet, meticulous discipline. We built a beautiful life here. This very house, a custom colonial nestled in one of the most serene, historic neighborhoods of Oakville, was my sanctuary. I had bought the raw land in 1987, paid cash for the lot, and supervised every single day of its construction. Every floorboard, every piece of crown molding was measured and laid with my own hands. Margaret had been gone for 2 years now. Her framed portrait sat on my desk, her gentle eyes looking back at me, a silent reminder of the love that once filled these empty rooms. And now, our only son, David, was gone too, taken from this world in a horrific car accident on the Coup just 2 weeks ago. My heart was a hollow chamber of grief. Everything I had built, every sacrifice Margaret and I had made, was supposed to be a legacy for David. I believed we were a tight-knit, respectable Canadian family. How foolish I was to trust the woman my son had brought into our home. The signs of Victoria's true nature had been there all along, but grief has a way of making a father blind. During the funeral arrangements at the chapel in Oakville, Victoria immediately took complete control of the stage. "Don't worry about a thing, Tom," she had said, her voice dripping with a polished, synthetic sweetness. "I'll handle the logistics. You just focus on grieving." What she really meant was, stay out of my way. At the funeral home, she paraded around in an immaculate, custom-tailored black dress that cost $1,500. A dress I knew had been purchased using David's corporate credit card just days before his death. She commanded the chapel like she was the director of a tragic, high-society play, greeting the wealthy real estate elite of Halton, shaking hands, and accepting condolences like she was the newly crowned queen of the Mercer estate. When I quietly suggested playing David's favorite song during the memorial slideshow, a classic Canadian folk song we used to sing together while painting the garage in the summer of '87, Victoria cut me off with a sharp, dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "Absolutely not, Thomas," she whispered sharply, her eyes scanning the room to make sure no one was listening. "That is far too depressing and incredibly outdated. We need something modern, something uplifting. We have very important clients from Royal Lepage and Bay Street coming today. I will not have this service looking like a museum exhibit of the 1980s. It was a knife to the chest. She wasn't honoring my son. She was hosting a networking event, using David's casket as a backdrop to elevate her own social standing in Oakville. And me? I sat in my old gray suit, the very one I had worn to my wife's funeral, feeling like an invisible ghost in my own son's memory. I watched her whisper to her colleagues, pointing at me with a look of mock pity. "The poor man," I overheard her tell our neighbor, Helen Sterling. "Thomas just doesn't understand finances or modern life. David handled absolutely everything for him. He's completely lost without us." Helen shot me a sympathetic, patronizing look. She had known me for 37 years, since the day I broke ground on Maple Street. Yet, even she seemed to immediately swallow Victoria's fabricated reality. Victoria looked at my old, 15-year-old Honda Civic in the driveway. She looked at my simple, unbranded clothes. She saw my quiet, dignified grief and mistook my humility for helplessness. She assumed that because I didn't boast, because I didn't wear my wealth on my sleeve, I was a penniless, dependent burden. She was about to learn a lesson that would cost her everything, because the quietest people in the room are often the ones who hold all the cards, and my hand was already dealt. The reception after the funeral was held in my living room. The very room where Margaret and I had hosted decades of Christmas dinners, where David had opened his presents as a boy, and where we had gathered to mourn just 2 years ago. Now, it was filled with people dressed in expensive black attire, talking in hushed, artificial tones. Victoria moved through the crowd like a seasoned politician. I watched her from David's old leather armchair, the one I had bought him for his 16th birthday. She was holding a crystal wine glass, her face a perfect mask of tragic resilience as she stopped to speak with Helen Sterling, my neighbor of 37 years. "It's just so heartbreaking," Victoria whispered, her voice carrying easily across the quiet room. She sighed, casting a theatrical, pitying glance toward my corner. "Thomas is having such a difficult time adjusting. Ever since Margaret passed, his cognitive health has been declining. He's starting to show signs of mild, age-related memory loss. He completely loses track of his own affairs." David had to manage absolutely everything for him, down to the last dollar. Without David to guide him and pay his bills, I honestly don't know how the poor man is going to survive. Helen Sterling looked over at me, her eyes filled with a deep, misplaced sympathy. She had known me since we broke ground on this street. She knew I had been a chartered professional accountant for 40 years. Yet, looking at my quiet demeanor, my worn gray suit, and my absolute silence, she chose to believe Victoria's polished lie. I sat there, sipping my lukewarm tea, and didn't utter a single word of protest. I let the whispers wash over me. In my 40 years of auditing financial records, I had learned a fundamental truth about human nature. People only see what they expect to see. Victoria looked at my 15-year-old Honda Civic parked in the driveway. She saw me clipping discount coupons for Canadian Tire. She saw my simple, unbranded flannel shirts. Because I chose to live quietly, because I didn't flash my wealth to feed a hollow ego, her shallow mind immediately categorized me as a broke, helpless, and senile old man who was entirely dependent on her charity. She had built a mountain of assumptions on a foundation of sand, and she was about to watch it collapse. As the crowd in the living room began to thin, Victoria caught my eye. With a sharp, commanding nod, she gestured toward the kitchen. I stood up slowly, keeping my movements deliberate, and followed her. The moment the heavy swing door closed behind us, cutting off the polite chatter of the guests, her tragic face vanished. The grief-stricken widow disappeared, replaced instantly by the cold, ruthless real estate agent who was used to closing aggressive deals on Bay Street. She didn't offer me a glass of water. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She simply leaned against my granite countertop, crossed her arms, and looked down her nose at me. "Thomas, we need to talk about your situation," she announced, her voice sharp and devoid of any warmth. "My situation?" I asked quietly. "Let's not play games," she sighed, checking her designer watch with irritation. "You are financially dependent on this household. David was supporting you, but now that he is gone, the dynamics have completely changed. I cannot, and will not, carry a worthless financial burden. I have my own lifestyle, my own career, and my own future in Oakville to think about. This house is mine now. Everything David had belongs to me. And frankly, I need you out." "Out?" I repeated, keeping my voice entirely flat, letting her build her own cage. "Yes, out," she spat, her eyes scanning the kitchen we were standing in. The very kitchen Margaret and I had spent 6 months planning and building. "I've already done the homework for you. I looked into some local facilities, and Sunset Manor over in Hamilton has an immediate opening. It's a basic studio apartment, only $800 a month. That should leave you with a few dollars from your monthly government pension for groceries. It's a highly appropriate situation for someone in your position. $800 a month." She was standing in my custom-built, debt-free home, which she estimated to be worth over $400,000, and telling me to go live in a rundown, state-subsidized studio in Hamilton. She was telling a retired CPA, a man who had successfully managed multi-million-dollar corporate portfolios, that he was a financial liability. She wanted me to be grateful. She wanted me to thank her for giving me 30 days to pack up 40 years of my life instead of throwing me out into the autumn rain immediately. She expected me to beg, to cry, or to argue. But I did none of those things. I looked at the sharp, aggressive lines of her face. I looked at her manicured hands resting on the counter I had paid for. I felt the sting of her words, the word burden echoing in the quiet kitchen, but I didn't let a single emotion break through the surface of my face. "I understand, Victoria," I said quietly. A flash of absolute triumph crossed her eyes. She took my quiet response as total defeat. She thought she had broken the old man, that I was going to pack my bags like a good, obedient senior and shuffle off to the shadows of Sunset Manor without a fight. What she didn't see was the meticulous, mathematical calculation happening behind my eyes. She had no idea that David had never owned a single brick of this house. She had no idea that the money she thought she was inheriting was currently locked inside a private trust that she couldn't touch, even with a team of high-priced lawyers. "Good," Victoria said, straightening up, her voice returning to its brisk, business-like tone. "I'm glad we're on the same page. I'll print out the official transition timeline for you tonight. Let's make this as quiet as possible, Thomas." "We don't need any unnecessary drama." "Of course," I replied, turning toward the sink to rinse my empty teacup with absolute, agonizing care. "No unnecessary drama." As she pushed open the kitchen door and walked back into the living room to resume her perfect performance for the Oakville elite, I stared at the mist rolling off Lake Ontario through the kitchen window. She wanted a quiet transition. She wanted to slip me into the shadows. But tomorrow, the paper trail was going to begin, and the quiet father was about to show her exactly how much an assumption can cost. On Friday afternoon, while Victoria was out showing a multi-million-dollar estate in South Oakville, I did something I hadn't done since my son's tragic accident. I went down to the basement. Throughout my 40 years of marriage to Margaret, this basement had been my personal sanctuary. It was cool, dry, and quiet. Thick with the comforting, nostalgic scent of aged cardboard, cedar wood, and old paper. Margaret used to laugh and tell our neighbors that I was like a squirrel down there, hoarding away every single receipt, bill, and bank statement as if they were precious acorns for a harsh winter. "You never know when you will need proof, Margaret," I would always tell her with a smile. She would roll her eyes, but as a chartered professional accountant, I knew a fundamental truth that many learn too late. Memories fade, people lie, but paper trails always tell the absolute truth. The heavy, four-drawer steel filing cabinet stood exactly where I had left it in the far corner, tucked beneath the sturdy wooden joists of the house. It was a gray, industrial powerhouse, meticulously organized by decade, by category, and by year. It was a physical library of my family's financial history. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small, tarnished brass key on my keyring, and slid it into the lock of the bottom drawer. With a heavy, metallic scrape, the drawer slid open, revealing hundreds of perfectly cataloged green hanging folders. I ran my fingers over the labels until I found the tab I was looking for: real estate, 447 Maple Street. I pulled the folder from the drawer and laid it flat on my workbench under the pale, buzzing fluorescent light. The first document at the very front of the stack was the original land purchase agreement, dated March 12, 1987. It was signed by Thomas Mercer as the sole buyer. I had paid $43,000 in cash for the raw, wooded lot overlooking the lake. The second document was the construction contract with Halton Custom Builders. The total contract price was $78,000. And then, there it was. The crown jewel of the file. The original, government-registered deed of land, stamped and recorded on March 15, 1987, by the Land Registry Office of the Province of Ontario. I traced my fingers over the faded ink. Owner: Thomas Mercer. No cosigner. No joint ownership. No mortgage. I had paid exactly $121,000 in cold, hard cash to buy the land and construct this beautiful colonial house from the ground up. David's name appeared nowhere on the deed. He had been a toddler, barely learning to take his first steps on the grass of the backyard while I was signing these blueprints. He had grown up here, yes. He had loved this house, absolutely. But he had never owned a single square inch of the land. Victoria had lived in this house for 8 years as David's wife, but in her arrogance, she had never bothered to look at a property deed or a mortgage statement. She had simply assumed that because David was a successful engineer, the house belonged to him. She had assumed her marriage certificate was a golden ticket to my estate. But the folder held even more damning evidence. As I dug deeper, I pulled out a thick, bound stack of property tax assessments from the town of Oakville, spanning 37 continuous years. Because Oakville is one of the most affluent and highly taxed municipalities in the Greater Toronto Area, the property taxes on this lakeside lot were astronomical. I looked at the most recent bill from the region of Halton. The annual property tax was exactly $8,412. Beneath the bill were the matching bank transaction receipts. Every single dollar, for 37 years, had been paid directly from my personal RBC accounts. David had never paid a single cent of the property taxes. He had never paid the home insurance premiums. He had never paid the major structural maintenance bills. Victoria had stood in my living room, in front of our neighbors, boasting that David had spent $40,000 a year, keeping me afloat and paying my bills. She had painted me as a helpless, bankrupt senior living off their financial mercy. But the paper trail in my hands proved the exact opposite. David had lived here rent-free, protected by my quiet generosity, while I quietly maintained the entire financial foundation of their comfortable lives. I closed the folder, the heavy paper snapping shut in the quiet basement. I locked the steel drawer with a sharp, metallic click. I stood in the dim light, holding the folder tightly against my chest. Victoria had given me until November 15th to pack my bags. She was planning to renovate my kitchen, change my locks, and sell my memories to the highest bidder. She believed she held all the power. I walked back up the wooden stairs, locking the basement door behind me. The cold anger inside me had settled into an unbreakable, crystalline resolve. Victoria had spent 2 months building a massive tower of lies, but I was holding the legal dynamite that would blow her foundation to pieces. The quiet father was ready to speak, and when a CPF finally presents his audit, there is no room left for negotiation. But the green hanging folder for the Maple Street property was merely the outer wall of my defense. To find the true heart of my late wife, Margaret's, and my life's work, I had to reach to the very back of the bottom drawer. Tucked behind the thick dividers, almost invisible in the shadows of the low basement ceiling, sat a heavy, fireproof lockbox. It was a solid, black, steel safe that I had bolted directly to the concrete floor behind the filing cabinet. I knelt on the cold concrete, my joints popping in the quiet room, and turned the mechanical combination dial. Left to 32, right to 85, left to 19. With a heavy, satisfying metallic clank, the locking bolts retracted. Inside lay a single, thick leather binder bound with brass screws. Embossed on the cover in faded gold lettering were the words, "The Thomas and Margaret Mercer Family Trust, established June 15th, 1985. I pulled the binder out and laid it on the wooden workbench under the single, dim yellow light bulb hanging from the rafters. The golden light flickered slightly, casting long, dancing shadows across the concrete walls of my sanctuary. I opened the cover, the heavy parchment paper rustling in the stillness of the room. This was the document that Victoria had never known existed. This was the secret vault of the Mercer family, constructed long before David was even born, and funded through 40 years of my relentless work as a chartered professional accountant. I flipped to the most recent financial statement from the Royal Bank of Canada, dated October 31st, 2024. There, printed in clean, indisputable black ink, was the current liquid balance of the trust, $853,412 Canadian dollars. As I stared at the numbers, a cold, dry smile touched my lips. Victoria had spent 8 years believing my son David was a self-made financial prodigy. She saw the high-end vacations, the designer clothing, and the luxury lifestyle they enjoyed, and she assumed David's engineering salary was funding all of it. But she had never understood the real mathematics of his life. David was a brilliant geological engineer, yes, but a young engineer in Ontario does not make enough to buy a South Oakville lifestyle. He was comfortable because I had made sure he was comfortable. Under the strict terms of the Mercer Family Trust, David was never an owner or a trustee. He was merely a passive beneficiary. Every single month, a calculated allowance was transferred from this trust to David's personal account to cover their high-end housing expenses, their travel, and their country club memberships. I had structured it this way to protect him, to give him a beautiful life while keeping the core capital completely out of reach from outside liabilities, and from the predatory eyes of anyone he might marry. Victoria had spent nearly a decade bragging to her real estate colleagues about her husband's independent wealth, completely blind to the fact that she was living off my quiet, meticulously managed generosity. She was a parasite living off a host she couldn't even see, but the final, most devastating blow to Victoria's grand plans was nestled on the very last page of the trust binder. It was David's corporate life insurance policy through his engineering firm, a policy worth exactly $150,000. Just yesterday, I had overheard Victoria on the phone in the hallway, her voice filled with excitement as she talked to a luxury kitchen designer. She was already spending that $150,000 in her head. She was planning to rip out my custom oak cabinets, replace my granite countertops, and turn my family home into a sterile, modern showpiece before putting it on the market. She was so incredibly certain that as his widow, that check would be written directly to her name. But she had never read the policy. I traced my finger along the printed line of the official beneficiary designation form, signed by David 8 years ago on the day of their wedding. Primary beneficiary, the Thomas and Margaret Mercer Family Trust. My son had been a good man. He had respected our family's discipline, and he had followed my professional advice to the letter. He had designated the trust as the sole recipient of his life insurance, ensuring that if anything ever happened to him, The funds would return to the fortress I had built to be managed by me. Victoria was building an entire future on a foundation of ghosts. She was making contracts, hiring designers, and planning a luxurious new life on Bay Street using $600,000 in assets that she had absolutely no legal right to touch. She thought she was evicting a helpless old man to claim her kingdom. She had no idea that she was walking directly into a legal trap of her own making. I closed the leather binder and locked the black steel safe with a heavy, final click. I took a slow breath of the cool basement air. The fog outside was pressing hard against the glass, but inside, my path was clear. Victoria wanted me out by November 15th. She wanted to play the ruthless queen. I walked back up the stairs, carrying the proof of her absolute ruin in my hands. The quiet father was about to speak, and when the truth finally echoed through her perfect, polished world, the cost of her assumptions was going to be more than she could ever afford to pay. Thursday morning brought another wave of bitter, freezing mist rolling off Lake Ontario, wrapping around the trees on Maple Street like a shroud. I was sitting at my kitchen table, having a quiet breakfast of toast and black coffee, when the silence was abruptly shattered. There was no polite knock on the door, no gentle call of greeting, just the cold, metallic sound of a key turning in my deadbolt, followed by the heavy slam of the front door. A second later, the sharp, rapid click-clack of designer heels marched down the hallway, heading straight toward the kitchen. It was Victoria. She had used David's old spare key, the one I had given my son years ago for emergencies, to let herself into my home as if she already owned every square foot of it. She walked into the kitchen, her face tight, her eyes cold, carrying a thick manila folder tucked tightly under her arm. She didn't look at me. She didn't ask how I was sleeping. She simply pulled out the chair directly opposite me, dragged it back with a loud scrape, and sat down without being invited. "Tom, we need to talk," she announced, her voice sharp and dripping with clinical authority. She opened her folder and laid a legal pad covered in her aggressive handwriting flat on the table, right next to my coffee mug. "I've been reviewing our immediate transition plan, and I need you to declare all the household expenses. I need the average monthly cost for the water, the heating, and the hydro." I slowly set my coffee cup down, keeping my eyes locked on her. "And why exactly do you need my utility bills, Victoria?" "Because I need to budget properly," she spat, looking at me as if I were a slow-witted child. "Until you pack up and move to Sunset Manor on November 15th, I will have to carry these costs. I need to know exactly what David was covering for you so I don't get hit with unexpected bills. It's only fair that I prepare my finances before the transition." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands over my lap, letting the absolute silence of the kitchen stretch between us. "You are very certain about this timeline, Victoria, and you are very certain about your rights to this property." "Of course I am," she scoffed, leaning forward, her manicured fingers tapping sharply against her legal pad. "I'm not just certain, Tom. I am a real estate professional. I know exactly how estate distribution works in this province. I was David's legal wife. He is gone, which means I am the sole surviving heir. Under Ontario family and estate law, this house, his assets, and everything he owned naturally inherit to me. It's a closed case. This property is legally mine." I looked at her, letting a cold, microscopic smile hover at the edge of my lips. "Tell me, Victoria, in the 8 years you were married to my son, and the 8 years you lived under this roof, did you ever actually see the registered deed to this land? Did you ever look at a single land registry document for 44-7 Maple Street?" The question hung in the quiet room like a freezing draft. For a fraction of a second, the supreme confidence in Victoria's eyes flickered. A tiny muscle twitched in her jaw, her polished composure cracking just enough to reveal the deep-seated arrogance underneath. She slapped her hand flat against the table, her voice rising, echoing sharply off the kitchen cabinets. "I don't need to see some dusty piece of paper from 30 years ago. Thomas," she yelled, her eyes flashing with anger. "You are in absolute, complete denial. I know you are grieving David, and I've been trying to be patient with you, but this pathetic delusion has to stop. You are a 70-year-old man on a fixed income, living in a fantasy world because you can't accept the reality of your financial situation. David supported you. He owned this estate, and now it belongs to me." She stood up, towering over me, her knuckles pressed white against the table as she leaned down, her face inches from mine. "Let me make one thing crystal clear to you, old man," she whispered, her voice cold, venomous, and completely ruthless. "You have until November 15th to gather your things and get out. I have already scheduled a locksmith to come to this property at 9:30 am on the morning of the 16th. If you are not gone by then, I will change every single lock on this house, and the local sheriff will trespass you from my land. Don't test me on this, Thomas. You have no money, you have no leverage, and you have no power. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I sat there in my chair, looking up at her with a calm, unbothered gaze that seemed to infuriate her even more. She thought she was delivering a death sentence to a helpless senior. She had no idea she was just handing me another piece of incriminating evidence. "I hear you, Victoria," I said, my voice incredibly soft, quiet, and steady. "Good," she snapped, gathering her papers and shoving them back into her folder with a violent rustle. "Keep clipping your coupons, Tom. You're going to need them." She turned on her heel and marched out of the kitchen, her high heels clicking aggressively down the hallway before the front door slammed shut once more, shaking the glass panes of the window. I sat alone in my quiet kitchen. I picked up my mug and took a slow, warm sip of my coffee. November 15th. The deadline was set. She thought she was going to lock me out of my own life. But she was about to find out that when the quiet man finally speaks, he doesn't just raise his voice. He brings down the entire house. Sunday morning brought a crisp, freezing sunlight that danced on the frosted surface of Lake Ontario. I was in the hallway, wearing my best Sunday suit, preparing to leave for St. Jude's Anglican Church. It was a routine of quiet reflection I had kept for decades. But just as I reached for my car keys on the console, my front door swung open. There was no warning. Victoria marched into my foyer, leading 3 other women behind her like a queen commanding her court. They were all dressed in flashy, expensive designer winter coats, carrying leather clipboards and high-end smartphones. I recognized them immediately as her colleagues from Premier Realty. They didn't wipe their feet. They left wet, muddy tracks of melting snow across the pristine oak floor Margaret, and I had kept spotless for 37 years. Oh, my God, Victoria, you weren't kidding. A tall, blonde woman named Jessica gasped, looking around my living room with an expression of sheer disgust. The bones of this place are absolutely fabulous, but the decor, it is literally a time capsule. It's like stepping back into the Soviet Union. I know, right? Victoria laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed off the high ceilings. I've already hired a contractor to gut the entire main floor. This ridiculous, outdated wood paneling is the first thing to go. And this furniture, it's like a museum of things that should have been thrown away 30 years ago. I stood perfectly still at the bottom of the staircase, my hand resting lightly on the banister. They walked right past me as if I were a piece of old, dusty drywall. A third woman, Beatrice. A sharp-eyed agent with a tight, calculating smile who was Victoria's fiercest rival at the firm, walked over to Margaret's antique mahogany hutch. She picked up a delicate, hand-painted ceramic teacup, one my late wife had brought with her from England, and turned it over with a sneer. "Is she actually planning on keeping this junk, Victoria?" Beatrice asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweet poison. "Or are we just throwing it all in a dumpster on November 16th? "It's all going to charity, Beatrice," Victoria replied loudly, making sure her voice carried directly to where I was standing. She turned to the group, gesturing toward me with a pitying shake of her head. "You'll have to excuse Thomas. He's David's father. Ever since David died, he's been having a really hard time accepting reality. His mind is, well, it's not what it used to be. He's suffering from severe cognitive decline and memory loss. Poor thing. He genuinely believes he still has a say in what happens to this estate. He doesn't understand that he can't afford to maintain a place of this caliber on a basic government pension. He's completely dependent on my goodwill now." "The sad reality of aging," Jessica muttered, snapping another photo of my fireplace mantel, deliberately knocking over a framed picture of David as a boy to get a better angle. She didn't bother to pick it up. I stood there in my quiet, old-fashioned suit, watching them. I didn't scream. I didn't demand they leave my house. I looked at each of their faces, registering their features, the name tags on their designer coats, and the sheer, arrogant greed in their eyes. I looked especially at Beatrice. I saw the way her eyes lingered on Victoria, not with friendship, but with a predatory hunger, waiting for Victoria to make a single mistake so she could claim her top agent spot at Premier Realty. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air from the open front door settle my mind. I adjusted my cuffs, picked up my leather gloves, and walked calmly toward the front door, passing right through the middle of their little circle. Just before I stepped out into the freezing Oakville morning, I paused on the threshold. I turned back and looked directly at Beatrice, then at Jessica, and finally at Victoria. The silence that fell over the foyer was sudden, heavy, and suffocating. "Ladies," I said, my voice incredibly quiet, calm, and measured, carrying the absolute authority of a retired CPA who had spent 40 years reading between the lines. I can see you are already planning some very expensive, very extensive renovations for this property. You are planning to gut the kitchen, tear down the walls, and change the locks. Victoria sneered, crossing her arms. We are doing what needs to be done, Tom. You should go to church and let the professionals work. I ignored her completely, keeping my eyes locked onto Beatrice's calculating face. But before you invest your valuable time, your agency's resources, and your professional reputations into this project, I continued, my voice steady as stone, I highly recommend you ask Victoria to show you the registered deed to this house. Make sure you see the actual, government-certified land registry documents for 44-7 Maple Street before you draft a single contract. Beatrice's eyes narrowed instantly. She shot a sharp, suspicious glance toward Victoria. What is he talking about? Victoria, you have the deed, right? He's just confused. Victoria snapped, her face suddenly flushing an ugly, dark red as she stepped toward me. He's old! Beatrice! He doesn't know what he's saying! Tom, get out of here right now! I didn't say another word. I simply offered Beatrice a polite, dignified nod, turned on my heel, and walked out down the salted driveway toward my 15-year-old Civic. Behind me, through the glass of the front door, I could hear the immediate rise of tense, whispering voices. The safari was over. The vultures had just smelled a different kind of blood. And as I started my engine, I knew that the seed of doubt had been planted in the very office Victoria thought she controlled. They thought they were dealing with a weak, senile old burden. They were about to find out that a quiet man doesn't need to yell to destroy your entire career. He just needs to point the wolves in the right direction. On Monday morning, I drove down the Queen Elizabeth Way, leaving the freezing mist of Oakville behind as the towering glass giants of downtown Toronto rose to meet me. My destination was the financial district, specifically the high-rise offices of Eleanor Vance. Eleanor had been my trusted legal counsel for over 20 years. She was a brilliant, sharp-witted estate lawyer who wore her tailored suits like suits of armor. When she ushered me into her corner office, the air was warm, smelling of rich espresso and old leather-bound books. Without a word of small talk, I opened my briefcase. I placed 3 distinct, heavy manila folders onto her polished mahogany desk. The original 1987 deed to 447 Maple Street, 37 years of meticulously cataloged property tax receipts, and the brass-locked binder containing the Thomas and Margaret Mercer family trust. Eleanor, I said, my voice dead, flat, and colder than the wind off the lake. My daughter-in-law has given me until November 15th to pack my bags and move into a state-subsidized studio. She claims she has inherited my house and David's entire life. I need you to help me show her the law. Eleanor didn't say a word. She put on her reading glasses, pulled the documents toward her, and began to read. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the crisp, rhythmic rustle of paper. As Eleanor reached the bottom of the stack, her sharp eyes narrowed. She pulled up her secure legal portal on her computer terminal, running a rapid search on the recent corporate filings and bank records associated with my son David's accounts at the Royal Bank of Canada. Thomas, she said, leaning back in her leather chair, her expression hardening into something incredibly dangerous. We have a much bigger problem than an arrogant daughter-in-law. Victoria isn't just making assumptions. She is actively committing fraud. I leaned forward. What did she do? Eleanor. She has already filed a temporary power of attorney and an estate claim with RBC, using her status as David's grieving widow to bypass standard probate, Eleanor explained, pointing to the glowing monitor. She submitted a drafted, unauthorized authorization letter, one she clearly forged David's signature on before his death, attempting to gain immediate, absolute access to David's personal corporate accounts. She is trying to drain his liquid assets before the bank can freeze them for probate. She thinks she can slip this through the system because of the family crisis. Dark, freezing anger settled deep into my chest. Victoria wasn't just greedy, she was a criminal. She was willing to forge her dead husband's name to steal every last penny. How do we stop her? I asked, my knuckles turning white against my cane. We don't just stop her, Thomas, Eleanor said, a predatory, brilliant smile crossing her lips. We let her walk straight into the trap. Eleanor pulled a fresh stack of legal documents from her drawer, sliding them toward me with a decisive snap. Prong 1 is the insurance money, Eleanor whispered, her eyes gleaming. I am submitting the formal death benefit claim for David's $150,000 policy directly to the insurer today. Because the trust is the sole designated beneficiary, that money will be deposited into the Mercer family trust within 48 hours. Victoria will receive absolutely nothing, and she won't find out until she tries to cash a check that doesn't exist. And prong two? I asked. Prong two is how we reclaim your dignity, Eleanor said, tapping a document labeled 30-day statutory notice to vacate. We are serving her with a formal eviction notice. Under Ontario law, since she has no lease and is not an owner, she is legally classified as an unauthorized occupant on your property. She is trespassing. But we are not going to mail these papers, Thomas, and we are not going to serve them quietly at your house. She looked at me, making sure I understood the brilliance of her plan. We are going to walk straight into Premier Realty tomorrow morning, at 10 o'clock, when the entire office is fully staffed, when her managing broker, her wealthy clients, and her precious colleague Beatrice are all watching. I will personally read these documents aloud, in front of everyone she has lied to. We will expose her fraud, serve her the eviction, and watch her entire professional empire collapse in real time. I didn't hesitate. I picked up Eleanor's gold pen and pressed it to the paper. My signature was smooth, steady, and unbroken. The quiet father was no longer just protecting his home. I was about to dismantle the monster who had tried to erase my family's legacy. As I walked out into the cold Toronto air, the storm didn't feel threatening anymore. The trap was set, and Victoria was about to find out that the most dangerous man in the room is the one who has nothing left to lose. On Tuesday morning at exactly 10 o'clock, the glass doors of Premier Realty on the main street of Oakville swung open. The office was bustling with energy, bathed in the bright morning light reflecting off Lake Ontario. At her desk near the front, Victoria was leaning forward, her face lit up with her signature, million-dollar real estate smile. She was in the middle of pitching a South Oakville, listing to a young, affluent couple who looked ready to sign a massive contract. But the moment Eleanor Vance and I stepped into the room, the temperature in the office seemed to drop to absolute freezing. Victoria looked up, her polished, professional smile instantly freezing on her face. Her eyes darted from me in my simple, quiet wool coat to Eleanor, who carried a thick, leather litigation briefcase. A flash of pure panic crossed Victoria's eyes before she quickly tried to mask it with her usual condescending authority. "Thomas?" Victoria said, her voice tight, a sharp edge cutting through her artificial sweetness. "What are you doing here?" As you can see, I am in the middle of a very important consultation with clients. This is highly inappropriate. If you are having another one of your episodes, you need to wait in the reception area. She looked at her young clients, offering a performative sigh of mock pity. "I'm so sorry, guys. My father-in-law has been having a very difficult time with his memory and cognitive health since my husband passed. He doesn't quite understand how a professional office operates." Actually, Eleanor Vance's voice cut through the room like a scalpel, loud, clear, and perfectly projected. "Mester, Mercer is in perfect health, and we are not here to wait." Around the office, the tapping of keyboards died. Victoria's managing broker stepped out of his corner office, his brow furrowed. Beatrice, Victoria's chief rival, slowly stood up from her desk, her eyes gleaming with predatory curiosity as she moved closer to the scene. Eleanor didn't give Victoria a chance to recover. With a swift, practiced movement, she unzipped her briefcase and slammed a thick, blue-backed legal folder flat onto Victoria's desk, right in front of her wealthy clients. "My name is Eleanor Vance, legal counsel for Thomas Mercer," Eleanor announced, her voice echoing off the high, lofted ceilings of the office. "We are here to correct several highly fraudulent, defamatory, and legally hazardous misconceptions that Victoria Fletcher has been spreading regarding the estate of the late David Mercer and the property located at 44-7 Maple Street." "Eleanor, stop this right now," Victoria hissed, her face turning an ugly, blotchy red as she tried to grab the documents. "This is private family business. This is public record," Victoria, Eleanor countered, slapping her hand over the files. She pulled out the first document. "For the benefit of your managing broker and your colleagues, let us review the deed. 44-7 Maple Street is owned solely, entirely, and debt-free by Thomas Mercer. Purchased in cash in 1987. Your late husband, David, never owned a single square inch of this land." "That's a lie!" Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking as her clients took a synchronized step back from her desk. "Here is the certified land registry copy," Eleanor continued coldly, sliding the paper toward the young couple, who immediately looked at it. "Furthermore, here are 37 years of property tax records, fully paid by Thomas Mercer from his personal accounts. Your husband David did not support his father. In fact, according to the records of the Thomas and Margaret Mercer Family Trust, David and you survived entirely on a monthly housing and lifestyle allowance provided by Thomas Mercer's private trust. You have been living off this man's quiet charity for 8 years while actively scheming to declare him mentally incompetent to steal his assets." The silence in the Premier Realty office was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Victoria's managing broker was staring at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Beatrice was practically vibrating with delight, her phone secretly recording the entire interaction from her hand. Victoria sank back into her leather chair, her chest heaving, her eyes wild and terrified. "The insurance," she whispered desperately, her voice losing all its power. "David's corporate life insurance policy. That's mine. That's $150,000. I have contracts signed. The life insurance claim was processed yesterday morning, Victoria," Eleanor said, a cold, victorious smile playing on her lips as she handed her one final paper. "The sole designated beneficiary of David's policy is the Mercer Family Trust. The funds have already been deposited into Thomas's accounts. You inherited absolutely nothing. You have zero assets, zero claim to this house, and zero credibility." Eleanor pulled out a final, blue-backed document and slapped it directly onto Victoria's laptop keyboard. "And this is your 30-day statutory notice to vacate the premises of 44-7 Maple Street. As an unauthorized occupant, you are trespassing on Mr. Mercer's land. If you are not gone by November 15th, you will be escorted out in handcuffs by the Halton Regional Police." Victoria stared at the eviction notice, her face drained of all color, looking like a ghost in her expensive designer office. The young husband of the client couple looked at the deed, then at Victoria, his face hardening into absolute disgust. "You don't even know who owns the house you live in?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "And you expected us to trust you with a $2 million real estate transaction? This is pathetic." "Wait, please. We can still write the offer," Victoria begged, reaching out, but the wife snatched her designer bag off the desk. "Do not call us again, Victoria," the wife spat. They turned on their heels and marched out of the office, the door chiming mockingly behind them. Victoria looked around the room. Every single agent, including her broker and a smiling Beatrice, was staring at her, witnessing the complete, brutal demolition of her career, her reputation, and her lies. I looked down at my daughter-in-law one last time. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The paper trail had spoken for me. "Have a productive Tuesday, Victoria," Eleanor said quietly. We turned and walked out of the office together, stepping back into the clean, crisp Oakville air. Behind us, the storm of her own making was about to tear her apart. The quiet father had delivered his audit, and the price of her disrespect was absolute ruin. They say news travels fast in small towns, but in the wealthy, tight-knit real estate circles of the Halton region, scandal travels at the speed of light. Within 48 hours of our confrontation at Premier Realty, the story of the greedy daughter-in-law who tried to evict her retired CPA father-in-law, only to discover she inherited absolutely nothing, spread like a digital forest fire. The video Beatrice had secretly recorded of Victoria's public humiliation found its way onto local community forums and social media. It didn't stop there. Infuriated local residents found the older footage of Victoria's colleagues talking about dumping my late wife Margaret's belongings. The backlash was instantaneous and merciless. Victoria's business pages on Facebook and her professional Google review profiles were flooded with thousands of angry, one-star reviews. Screenshots of the registered deed of 447 Maple Street and the trust documents were shared across local Oakville and Burlington neighborhood groups. A predatory agent who tries to exploit her grieving father-in-law cannot be trusted with your family's largest asset. One viral post read, gaining thousands of shares. Her listings vanished from the ML's multiple listing service database one by one as terrified sellers withdrew their properties, desperate to distance themselves from her toxic brand. Within a week, the managing broker of Premier Realty, facing immense pressure and a public relations nightmare, officially terminated Victoria's contract. She was stripped of her desk, her license association, and her standing in the community. She had built her entire identity on her high society Oakville reputation, and in a matter of days, that reputation was completely erased. 2 weeks after the disaster at her office, I was sitting in my study when my phone rang. It was Eleanor Vance. "Thomas," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with dry amusement. "Victoria's newly hired defense attorney just called my office. It seems your daughter-in-law is finally beginning to understand the cold, hard mathematics of her situation." "What does she want, Eleanor?" I asked, staring out the window at the gray, choppy waters of Lake Ontario. "She is desperate," Eleanor explained. "She knows she has 30 days to pack her bags, and with no job, no income, and her reputation in ruins, she has nowhere to go." Her lawyer made an official proposal. Victoria is offering to sign a formal lease agreement to remain at 44-7 Maple Street. She is offering to pay you $2,000 a month in rent for the next 6 months. I let out a soft, dry chuckle. $2,000 a month? For a 2,400 square foot custom colonial on the lakefront in Oakville? Market rent for this property is easily $3,500. Exactly, Eleanor agreed, her tone turning razor sharp. She is still trying to get a discount on your back, playing the victim. She wants you to show her family mercy while she figures out her life. How do you want to respond? Tell her lawyer that my mercy ended the moment she called me a worthless burden in front of my friends, I said, my voice steady, cold, and absolute. If Victoria wants to live in my house, she will be treated exactly like any other tenant on the market. The rent is $3,500 a month, no exceptions. And the terms? Eleanor asked, a knowing smile in her voice. First month's rent, last month's rent, plus a security deposit equal to 1 month's rent, all paid upfront in certified funds, I replied. That is exactly $10,500 CAD before she can even cross the threshold. And she has 48 hours to accept, or the eviction timeline remains exactly as scheduled. An hour later, Eleanor called me back. Victoria's lawyer had immediately rejected the counteroffer, admitting that his client simply did not have the liquid funds to cover $10,500. Her credit cards were maxed out from her lavish lifestyle, her $1,500 funeral dress, and her expensive designer handbags. With her commission streams frozen and no agency willing to hire her, she was completely bankrupt. The very system of wealth and status she had used to look down on me had turned its back on her. I hung up the phone and looked around my quiet, beautiful living room. The clock on the mantel ticked slowly, keeping time with the natural consequences of her choices. Victoria had spent years believing she was the smartest person in the room, using my generosity as a weapon to make herself feel powerful. But she had forgotten a fundamental rule of the audit. Eventually, the books must balance. November 15th was approaching rapidly, and Victoria Fletcher was about to find out exactly how cold an Oakville winter can be when you have burned every single bridge behind you. The 30-day eviction term finally expired on a beautiful, unusually warm spring afternoon. The harsh, freezing ice that had choked Lake Ontario for months had completely melted away, leaving a sparkling, endless blue mirror under a gentle sun. I stood on the wraparound porch of my Maple Street home, a cup of hot coffee in my hand, watching a lone taxi pull into the driveway. The rear door opened, and Victoria stepped out. The transformation was shocking. The polished, high society Bay Street real estate agent was gone. She wore a simple, unbranded coat, her hair tied back in a hurried ponytail, her face completely hollowed out by 2 weeks of public rejection and financial ruin. She walked up the wooden steps of the porch, holding a single cardboard moving box in her arms. She looked down at her feet, refusing to meet my eyes, before setting the box down on the wicker table. Inside the box were the belongings she had systematically erased from my house weeks ago. Margaret's framed photos, David's childhood drawings, and my old CPA certificates. "I brought these back," she said, her voice barely a whisper, hoarse and stripped of all its former arrogance. "I found them in the storage locker. They belong to you." "Thank you, Victoria," I replied quietly. She reached into her pocket, pulled out David's old spare key, and laid it on top of the cardboard box with a trembling hand. She stood there for a long, agonizing moment, looking out at the calm waters of the lake, her shoulders shaking slightly. "I lost everything, Tom," she said, a bitter, defeated tear escaping her eye. "My license, my listings, my job, my reputation. No agency in Ontario will even look at my resume. I'm moving to Columbus, Ohio next week, to start over from absolute scratch. I have nothing left." She finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, painful curiosity. "Can I ask you something? If I had been respectful from the beginning? If I had asked questions instead of making demands and treated you with kindness, would things have been different?" I met her gaze. I didn't offer her comfort. I didn't offer her a soft lie to make her feel better. I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and unyielding as the oak pillars of my house. "Respect is not a commodity, Victoria," I said, my voice steady, calm, and as solid as stone. "It is not something you negotiate only when you realize the other person holds the power. It was never negotiable." Victoria closed her eyes, nodding slowly as the truth of her own choices finally sank in. She turned without another word, walked down the porch steps, and got back into the waiting taxi. I watched the car pull out of my driveway and disappear down Maple Street, taking the last of the parasites away from my life forever. I carried the cardboard box into my quiet, pristine living room. The air inside was warm, smelling of fresh wood, polish, and brewing coffee. One by one, I pulled the treasures out of the box. I took Margaret's framed portrait and placed it gently back onto the center of the mantel, right above the fireplace. Her kind, gentle eyes looked back at me, and for the first time in 2 years, the hollow ache in my chest was replaced by a profound, comforting warmth. Next to her, I taped David's childhood drawing of our house back onto the refrigerator door, smoothing down the crinkled edges. I hung my old CPR certificates back on the study wall, reclaiming the physical proof of the 40 years of hard work that had built this sanctuary. As I placed the last photo frame on the mantle, the doorbell rang. I opened the front door to find Helen Sterling standing on the porch, wearing a warm, genuine smile, carrying a freshly baked apple pie that filled the spring air with the scent of cinnamon and baked apples. "I saw the taxi leave, Tom," Helen said softly, her eyes scanning the living room behind me, taking in the restored photos. "I thought you might appreciate some neighborly company and a hot slice of pie." "Come in, Helen," I smiled, stepping aside. "The coffee is just finished." We sat on the porch, enjoying our pie, watching the golden afternoon sun paint the surface of Lake Ontario in brilliant shades of amber and gold. The house behind me was completely clean, completely organized, and completely quiet. My daughters-in-law, my colleagues, and the greedy opportunists of Oakville had looked at my quiet nature, my 15-year-old Civic, and my humble lifestyle, and they had assumed I was a weak, helpless victim. They thought they could rewrite history, steal my life's work, and throw me into the shadows because I chose not to yell. But they had made a fatal mistake. I was never weak. I was never helpless. I was simply selective about when to use my voice. And when I finally spoke, I spoke with the absolute, unbreakable authority of a father who protects his legacy and his peace at all costs. My name is Thomas Mercer. I am the quiet father, and my life is finally, truly beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If Thomas's journey touched your heart, and if you believe that boundaries and self-respect are worth fighting for, please hit the like button, subscribe to the Quiet Father channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know, did Thomas do the right thing? To listen to our next story of quiet strength and justice, click on the video on the left. Stay safe, stay strong, and until next time, protect your peace.